I'm Kate Livy, the Director of Education and the Associate Curator here at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, and I'd like to welcome you back to Chesapeake Treasure, a feature here on Facebook where we explore one of the more than 68,000 objects in the museum's collection. So today, looking ahead to Oyster Fest, which is the 28th of October here at the Maritime Museum, I wanted to talk about some of the things that I think many of you know that I'm incredibly passionate about, which is oysters. Specifically, I really wanted to explore some of the history and the lore associated with the time period of the Oyster Wars, which really runs between 1868 all the way through to 1959. So that's basically 101 years of wars on the Chesapeake, battles over a very unlovely, uncute, uncollectible resource known as oysters. So a little backstory, and I'm standing here in the oyster exhibition here at the Maritime Museum where we have a display and some objects that are related to the Oyster Wars. To kind of give you some context, historically speaking, really before the 1860s, oysters were harvested very slowly. There wasn't a lot of good technology to preserve them. When we talk about the oyster industry in the 18th century, it really was mostly enslaved people going out in small canoes to harvest oysters as a side job. It was never really an industry the way that it became in the 19th century. And the reason it became this huge industry is because of these really rapid industrial changes that all happened in Baltimore. One was the B&O Railroad, which would allow oysters to go further than ever before, right? Be transported further than ever before. Second was canning, which allowed oysters to be preserved longer than ever before. And the final one was oyster dredges, which allowed more oysters to be harvested than ever before. Dredges and canning both came from New England. Packers who were coming from places like New Haven, Connecticut, New York, and Boston came down to Baltimore to harvest the huge number of oysters in the Chesapeake, and they brought this big dredging technology and canning with them. Now, the B&O Railroad was established in Baltimore, so really you had kind of this, the perfect storm of technology and innovation that led to oysters becoming this huge product that for the first time became a truly commercial industry in the Chesapeake Bay. And so basically it meant you took a resource that before had been kind of free but not really worth anything to basically, incredibly abundant and incredibly valuable. Packing houses exploded overnight, not just in Baltimore, but anywhere the railroad touched in the Chesapeake that was near a really productive oyster bar. Places like here in St. Michael's, Solomon's Island, and Crisfield all just exploded overnight in the same way that Baltimore was. And what this meant is there was tremendous pressure to go out and harvest as many oysters as possible because they were worth a lot of money, especially if you had a bigger vessel like a skipjack. Now, in 1865, Maryland really embraced this new technology by allowing for the first time the use of dredges in the Chesapeake Bay, in the Maryland side of the Chesapeake Bay. Up until that point, they had not been legal to use. Now, this new technology really allowed kind of the rampant harvest of oysters, and to kind of mitigate that a little bit, there was supposed to be these rules that went along with this new legislation. Basically, the deep waters were state waters, and those were going to be reserved for dredgers. Shallow waters were known as county waters, and those were going to be for tongers. Now, everybody was just going to get along, right? Oh, sure, yeah, there was so much money to make, they were all just going to play so well. Oh, well, it turns out that wasn't the case. And in 1868, the state decided to create a governing body known as the State Fishery Force, or AKA the Oyster Navy, that was supposed to oversee the sort of rampant pillaging that was happening. Because what you had is the dredgers were harvesting from the tongers were arming themselves against these pirating dredgers, and these are people that are coming fresh off the Civil War. They knew how to use guns, and they were comfortable doing so. So you essentially had this incredible bounty that became a source of incredible contention. And what you had is essentially this explosion of regulators, right, the State Fishery Force. You had poachers, tongers, but mostly dredgers. And then the idea is that they were crossing lines between county and state, and then they were also crossing lines between Maryland and Virginia. So what you had between 1869 up till 1959 are examples like this. And this is Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper from January 7th, 1888. This is essentially like the Us Weekly of the 19th century. And what it is it's this pictorial spread that's depicting here the state fishery force in the foreground with those oyster poachers or pirates in the background. Now, the terminology pirates, terms that are developed to use in newspapers like these because they want to sell copies. And hell, we want to hear about oyster pirates now. They really wanted to hear about them back in this time period when this was really exciting stuff. I mean, this is just, you know, this is murder and this is piracy on the high seas of the Chesapeake Bay. So Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper covered this, but so did the New York Times, the New York Herald. National newspapers were covering the skirmishes on places like the Chester River. Engagement in the Chester River. This would have been a conflict between those Oyster Navy steamboats and the skipjacks and bucks wherever the oysters were thickest. The Little Choptank River, the Anamessex River, the Big Choptank River, the Chester River. All these places became these hot sources of, and breakouts of these skirmishes on the river. And a lot of these are not, I mean, we talk about piracy now and it sounds sort of like, you know, romantic, but in this time people were really getting, killed over access to this resource. Now, one of the objects we have I want to bring your attention to is this Remington revolver. The pirates, the oyster poachers that were out there harvesting oysters, they were prepared to kill. And there are several examples on the Chester River and others where the state fishery force arrived with cannons receiving gunfire from guns like this. And this Remington revolver was found on the bottom of a river known for its oysters. And it's in our collection today to indicate, the ways that oyster poachers were taking the law into and so what you see in the 19th century and into the early finite number of vessels that are, regulating this fishery. And they're using, this is a replica of a cannon, the type of cannon that you would have seen on some of these Oyster Navy vessels. They also were armed with howitzers and other types of weapons that were considered really cutting edge in that time period. They meant business. Now, this conflict continued. Oyster tongers against dredgers, Marylanders versus Virginians, state fishery force versus everybody else, really up until 1959. When there was one waterman, a poaching waterman, who was killed by state fishery force policemen. And that really marked the end of the oyster wars. What ended up happening is that in response, these state fishery regulators got rid of the firearms on board these vessels, and that really ended the dispute. Of course, that was followed rather rapidly by the impacts of MSX and Dermot in the 1980s and the 1990s conflict over oysters when those oyster populations were greatly depleted. So there's the terms oyster wars, oyster pirates, when you hear about them, these were real conflicts that really existed. And in the 19th century, they were followed as avidly as they are recounted today. It's a reminder to me, though, that oysters and that time period in our history is such an important chapter that has shaped our culture, shaped our traditions, and shaped our maritime communities. And if you come to Oyster Fest on October 28th, you can see the way that legacy of that tradition has continued, and the watermen that will be here, the music and the food, and of course, skipjacks and bug-eyes like the Edna Lockwood that are here under restoration at the Maritime Museum. Again, a remnant of that 19th century oyster boom heyday. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about an amazing